I'm going to be talking to you today about assessing project work, and it's a follow-on from Lukasz last week, who spoke to you about setting up project work and how to create successful PBL lessons. To give you a little bit of background about where I'm coming from, in my school, ATC, Language Schools, we have been doing project work face-to-face with students for 20 years or more. And then when the pandemic struck in 2020, everything went online. So we had to really reassess how we did project work with students in an online setting, and also make sure that the assessment of that project work was as robust as it would be in our traditional classrooms. So I'm going to go through some things with you today that hopefully will give you some help, some guidance on where to start if you need to assess your project work, either formatively, summatively in a formal way for your school, or a combination of both, okay? So I've kept the aims today very simple. Our aims are to better understand how to meaningfully assess project work in an online and offline setting, and to find practical solutions to assessing project work that can be immediately applied in your PBL lessons. So my aim today is for you to be able to take suggestions and templates and tips and use them straight away. Okay, so hopefully it's a nice practical way to end this series. So many of you were at the session last week where Lukasz talked about really good PBL lessons and how to set up a good PBL lesson. And I want you to cast your mind back to this day last week and suggest in the chat box, what does a project-based learning lesson need to be, or what does it need in order to be beneficial to students? Can you tell me in the chat box, what do we need to plan for, to include in our project-based lessons to really reap the benefit and help students benefit from the project? Chances to practice functional language. Thank you, Alice. Real life connection, learner-centered. These are excellent. This is exactly it. This is what we want from our PBL lessons. They should be practical. We need rubrics. It needs to be an interesting topic, problem solving, opportunity to apply competencies and skill. Absolutely, really important. And it needs to be motivating. Okay, it could have a theme. Yeah, I absolutely agree. Practical functional skills. The use of genuine English, that's a really good point. Critical thinking, being able to show and tell. Okay, so there's loads of suggestions there, and that's exactly, I was so relieved when I watched the session last week, and I thought it's great to see we're all on the same page when it comes to project-based learning. So when we're planning our PBL lesson, we need to make sure that it's authentic, that we have authenticity in there, that there's meaning and a connection to the real world, that the students can see the benefit of what they're doing, that it applies to real life. We need to give them space for creativity. And last week, Lukasz talked a lot about giving students space. Don't jump in too soon. Don't give them the answer. Don't give them the solution. Give them the space to be creative and to problem solve. The importance of something new and motivating and challenging is something that we need to bear in mind. So if it's a project that's far too easy for them, that's when you start to get the issues where they go off track and maybe there's behavioral issues. So giving them that stretch, as we know from last week's session and from our own experience, is really important. This is something that I am really going to focus on in this session about assessing project work. The focus on the process is as important as the project outcome. And keep that in mind, keep that to the front of your mind, because that's really where we're going to dig down into assessment. Again, giving these opportunities to problem solve and learn from mistakes, and that then leads on to opportunities for autonomous learning and helping our students become autonomous learners. A good structure for teacher and students, and this is another really key point that I'm going to focus on today. If you have a strong structure from the very beginning, before your first lesson, you will find assessment of the project work and the process of the project work much easier. So those are two things I want you to keep at the front of your mind: the focus on the process and a really good structure. These things will really help you when you're assessing projects. So we are all very used to offline projects, and particularly in my school in ATC, we were, our junior courses were mainly focused on projects and what the students would produce at the end of their stay. So the outcomes we're very familiar with in offline projects when we're in the classroom face to face. No matter what the topic, they might produce something like a model or a diorama. They might produce a series of information posters. They might have to give a presentation at the front of the class. It might have to be formal with a PowerPoint. They may even give a performance. So an example of a project outcome in the school I work with is radio projects where the students write, produce, and perform a radio show. And that includes the interviews with a celebrity, advertisements, everything got to do with the radio show, but they need to build up to that. They have a process building up to that performance. And they may even produce a whole portfolio of the work that they completed throughout the time of the project. And so they end up with a physical body of work. But our online project outcomes look a little bit different. They may have 3D or computer-assisted design models, but that's not to say they can't actually create real models on the other side of the screen. It just takes a little bit more planning. We have STEAM lessons, STEAM camps in ATC, which we delivered online for the past year and a half, where the students gathered their own materials and they did actually physically make things while on Zoom, and the teacher helped them out remotely. They may produce infographics using software and practicing their digital literacy. They may produce an electronic presentation using PowerPoint or something similar. And they may put it all together in a digital portfolio. So they have an electronic body of work. So when you compare like this, actually, you could argue that there is very little difference in the outcome of an offline project and an online project. We may end up with models or posters or presentations, a portfolio or a body of work. It's just how we approach the offline setting and the online setting and how we manage those materials that's challenging and that's different. So when we're assessing these outcomes, actually, we can assess them in a fairly similar way. It just depends on the material that you're expecting or the project outcome that you're expecting. So hopefully what I show you today, you will be able to apply in a face-to-face classroom and also in an online setting. So we've kind of recapped and we've thought about project-based learning and the outcomes of projects, and you've been thinking about last week's session. Now let's bring it back to assessment and let's think about what we traditionally assess in our English language lessons. So let's forget about projects for the moment. Can you tell me what you're normally expected to assess with your language students? What sort of things? Tell me in the chat. What sort of things do you normally assess? Vocabulary, fantastic. Grammar, pronunciation, all the skills, listening, speaking, reading, writing, functional language, spelling, fantastic. Yeah, this is what we assess. We're used to this. So we usually assess reading comprehension, spoken production, spoken interaction, listening, writing, and then we're also expected to assess grammatical accuracy, range of vocabulary. So we are assessing certain skills and we're used to assessing those for years and years. These are the things that we are expected to assess with our students in class. and their language competency as well. As Lukasz said last week, we kind of need to move away from that when we're assessing project work. We're going to look at slightly different things that we're going to assess. So before you start your project work, before the first lesson, before I go on, I want to acknowledge, this is really important. We need to face it, that assessment in any form isn't easy for teachers. You know that assessment is a science in itself. People spend their entire careers focused only on assessment. So getting this balance of assessing everything perfectly while trying to teach a class and get through a module or a term and make sure that students are on track and focused is not an easy thing to do. So if you struggle with assessment and you struggle to create your own assessments, don't worry, because you're not alone. Assessment is a tricky area and it's a huge area. So what I touch on today is just the tip of the iceberg. There's a huge amount to project-based assessment. And if you find it difficult, that's completely normal. That's okay, because it's not easy. But let's launch into it, okay? We know that we should see assessment as a way to improve our teaching and planning. It's a really good way for us to understand, actually, did I convey that information properly, and did I give the students the opportunity to use and create with that information? We can also see it as a way to allow our students to progress, but importantly, to see their own progression. And we can use it as a way to help students self-evaluate and understand how they work as individuals, how they work in groups, how they learn, and how they improve. And the great thing about project-based learning and about extended projects with classes is it really nails that third point. It really gives the opportunity for students to self-evaluate and self-assess along the way, to understand how they work in groups, to improve their interactional skills and their communication skills. It really does lend itself to this type of formative assessment, but also self-assessment with students. So yes, it is daunting thinking about how do I assess a whole project with groups and individuals within that group. But let's think of it from that really positive perspective, that there's no better way, actually, if we're to do assessment in a very student-centered, student-friendly way, project work is one of the best ways we can do it. So before you even start on your first day of project work, you need to decide as a teacher, what are you going to assess? What do you want to assess? You may just want to assess the project outcome, which is the solution that the students present at the end of the project work. But we know that the process is really important. So actually, you may need to assess the overall body of work. So from the beginning to the outcome, this might be the chunk that you want to assess. You also may want to assess how the project outcome and the entire body of work is presented. So maybe they worked really hard throughout the project and they came up with a good outcome, but then it was presented maybe in a sloppy way, or they needed to improve on that. So you might want to assess their presentation skills at the end. And finally, possibly one of the trickiest things is assessing the skills the students demonstrated throughout the project. So in an ideal world, throughout a project from start to finish, you would assess these 4 points. Now, this might change depending on your students or what your school expects, but it's a good way to think about it. You want to assess it as a whole rather than just the objective at the end, or the outcome at the end. So let's focus on those skills. Those skills are, it's almost an endless list. So I want you to tell me, what sort of skills do students practice during project-based lessons? Can you tell me in the chat, what sort of skills do they practice? So I see the 4 C's. So I assume you're talking communication, collaboration, creativity. We've got problem solving, teamwork, critical thinking. That's our 4th C. Anything else? Communication, role playing, very good. Emotional intelligence is really important. Research skills, cooperation, fantastic. Self-management skills, that's really important as well. Okay, group discussion, time frame, that is really important. Are they able to map their time out? Okay, so let's have a look. What sort of skills do they use? So we know that creativity is top of the list. Collaboration, but also negotiation, being able to negotiate with their group without fighting, without falling out, and coming to solutions and conclusions. Communication, leadership, critical thinking and analyzing, problem solving, planning, and planning is really important. Planning is something that you can absolutely assess from beginning to end in project work. Digital literacy, but also information literacy. So their research, what is the quality of their research? Did they use reliable sources? This can all be assessed. But how on earth do you assess all of these things? And this isn't even a complete list. We know that there are many, many skills that students use. One of the first things that you can bear in mind is not all at once. You don't need to assess all these skills over one project. What you could do is map out your academic year and split your projects up and focus on 3 or 4 skills within each project that you're going to assess each time. And maybe as the year goes on, the students start to integrate the skills that they practiced last time round into the next project. So you're building up, you're not assessing everything all in one go. Because the students, if they're not used to project work and being assessed in this way, probably won't be able to demonstrate everything all in one project. The other thing you can do when your students are really used to this type of lesson and used to being assessed in this way, possibly near the end of the academic year, you can allocate certain skills that will be assessed in certain groups. So it could be that one group found it difficult to communicate throughout the year. So in their last project, you're going to be assessing or putting more focus on their collaboration, negotiation, communication, and leadership, okay? You may have a group that had difficulty with their planning and their timeline. So at the same time, that group are going to be assessed on their planning, their tracking, and their timing of their project. So keep that in mind. You don't need to assess everything for everybody all in one go. You can split it up. So we now need to think about our students and how we're actually going to assess them. What techniques and tips are we going to use to assess the students in these different areas? One approach that I like to take is to think about our students as budding project managers. And in a meta kind of way, you're the project manager of the budding project managers, okay? So our students need to become good project managers. So to be a good project manager, they need to define what success looks like for their project. So immediately you see that the focus is going on to the student. They define what success looks like, and you can guide them, you can help them. They use success criteria to measure progress and what the team should be focused on. They use continuous measurements, reflection, and self-assessment as they go. They're constantly reflecting and assessing, are we on the right track? Do we need to change this? Is there something, have we gone wrong at some point? And really importantly, and it's the same in the professional world, we're all professionals and we've all completed projects and had to hand them in or report to a manager. Your students should be tracking their own progress and reporting on how the project is going. And it's within this budding project manager structure that you can assess them. How well are they tracking their progress and reporting on their progress? How well are they using their success criteria or meeting their success criteria? So this is the type of structure that will help you when you get down to actually, if you have to give them grades or you're giving them verbal comments, verbal feedback. And that brings us to structure. So now that you've decided you're going to treat your class as a group of budding project managers who need to really organize themselves and take ownership for their own project, you need a good structure in place so they can do it properly. So to assess the projects, we need structure for focus, clear goals and expectations, and a better project outcome. But I know you're screaming at the screen, how do I do that? I want practical examples. So here we go with practical examples. What can we use to improve structure and therefore improve the assessment of projects? We need rubrics. We need success criteria, and maybe you decide on the particular skills that you want the students to be successful at. We need a timeline, we need planning and tracking. That's not just your timeline and your planning and tracking, but the students' timeline and their planning and tracking. We need milestones. You need to know the milestones that the students will hit, and they need to know the milestones, and they need to work that in to their planning and their tracking. And then finally, you need a very strong presentation stage. The presentation stage of the outcome, the project outcome, includes much more than the project outcome, and there's lots of time for feedback from both the students in the audience, the teacher, and also time for reflection. So the students can make note of and think about what they did well and what they probably could have improved. So let's think of the very first lesson. It's all about structure and setting up a good structure so that you can assess the students really well, and they can also self-assess themselves. Give them the project brief, and then let them start to work out how they're going to be successful in this project. You can ask them, what do you think the outcome should be? And what does a successful outcome look like? What is success in your eyes? Here's the project brief, what you're going to need to do. Now I want you to tell me what a successful outcome looks like. So what looks like success in this particular project? Then they need to, in their groups, think about what will we need to do first? What do you think we'll be good at? What might be difficult in this project? And what skills are we really need to engage in to complete this project? Now they're doing this from day one, from when they see the brief. And it's just like Lukasz said last week, you're getting them started from the beginning. Don't give them the weekend to think about it. Let them dive straight into it. And what you're doing there is you're getting the students engaged and taking ownership from the very start. So here's an example of a template that can be used. Students can decide from the very first lesson, what does success look like to you? And they work in their groups to fill out the getting started document. Now you can do this any way you like. It's just an example of how from the start, students are creating their own records and being reflective from the very first lesson. So the project you can see here is a project about air pollution in Dublin. Your team will present a solution to Dublin's air pollution problem, and the outcome. Now, if your students are new to projects, you may want to give them the outcome, but as they get used to projects, you can get them to brainstorm a possible outcome. So the outcome will be at least one solution to Dublin's air problem that will have a significant impact on the air quality, and it will be presented in a clear and well-structured way with processes and evidence. And then we have a section above and beyond. So going beyond expectations. If they create a series of integrated solutions across the city of Dublin, that is above and beyond what's being asked. They can decide to stick to the normal outcome, or they can really push themselves and go above and beyond. So already you've set the expectation and what they should be aiming for. Now the students work together and they begin brainstorming straight away, exactly like Lucas talked about last week. You're getting them straight in there. They may not know the answers, but they're engaging in it immediately. And they're using this document to set their intentions, to create a focus, to plan from the very start, and to predict any obstacles or challenges that might arise. And then they keep this document with their body of work. This is something that will go towards assessment at the end. Now, we talked about rubrics, and rubrics can be quite a complicated concept. What we want to do is keep them simple, keep them as uncomplicated for you as a teacher as possible. Now, you're going to get these slides through PDF, but feel free to take a screenshot or take a photo of this if you want it immediately and you want to use it soon. So with your rubric, you want to keep it as clear as possible. And you may have a rubric that is only for you as the teacher, and a separate one in student-friendly language that the students can understand and can follow. Traditionally, rubrics are used to place a grade, to be able to grade a student. So you can keep it as that, or you can keep it without grades to help you summatively, assess the students in a non-summative way. So to assess them as they go along. But let's have a look at a filled in rubric. So this one I completed based on the air quality project with the students. So we have the project brief down the left-hand side, and we have the column that is exceeds expectations. If the students hit everything in that column, they're getting full marks, 24 marks, because they are above and beyond. But they may hit 3 from this column, 1 from the meets expectations, and 1 from needs improvement. So you can see as the columns progress, the students are producing less and less, or they're engaging in collaboration less and less. Now, this is work for you. This is something that you need to think through. What is the best of the best? What is the top mark? What do you expect? And then how do you grade it going backwards? As you can see from this particular rubric, I've written it in teacher language. So it's actually quite complicated. So what I would do before giving this to students is simplify it. Grade the language, make it as easy and as clear as possible. This is particularly for secondary school students, so teenagers. Perhaps with primary students, you would grade the language and use visuals at the same time. So a rubric is traditionally a very kind of teacher-focused tool, so that you know what you're looking for when you're looking at a student's work. But we want to make it as student-focused as possible. So that leads us on to the idea of success criteria. Now, with success criteria, this is where you really move into the students' measurement of their own success. So you can ask the students, how will you measure your own success in this project? How will you measure your team's success? Because that's very important. It's not just individual work. It's a team collaborative project. And again, thinking back to that first task that they did, imagining what a successful outcome to this project looks like. So what does success actually look like? It's a well-structured, well-prepared presentation with research and data, and everything is there for students to show. And of course, we need to give them a tool to be able to do this. If we just ask these questions, you're not really going to get much back from the students because you haven't given them enough support. So you need to give them a tool that they can fill in and work together. So here's an example of a very simple grid that you can give students. They're going to think about their success criteria regarding the project outcome, regarding the presentation, and then I've chosen 2 skills, collaboration and communication. But you as a teacher, you know your group, you know what you want to assess them on, you know what skills you want to assess them on. What I would say at the beginning is don't give them a big grid with every single 21st century skill on it, because this might, well, it'll cause confusion for everybody. It will be far too much and it's a little bit daunting. So I would chunk it up, okay? So you decide what skills you want to focus on during each project. Now, of course, they'll use other skills and those can be commented on when you give your feedback. But what are you assessing? Which skills are you actually assessing? There's no way you can assess all of them in one go. So here I've given the students some examples. Our project will be successful if we develop 1 or more solutions to air pollution in Dublin. Okay, so that's very clear for them. They know that they need 1 or more solution, so they know they'll be successful if they do that. Our group will be successful if we're able to show the science behind the solution using diagrams and our research. So they are now acknowledging and putting down on paper that they know that they have to back up their solution. It shouldn't just be something out of their head. They need to show that they've researched it and that they've put together an impressive presentation to convince you that this is a good solution to the air pollution problem in Dublin. And then with the presentation, they know that their group will be successful if every member of the group speaks during the presentation. Okay, so they know that if just one person speaks and the rest of them have their cameras off and microphones off, they're not going to do very well. Everybody needs to participate. So the group can then work together to fill in the rest of these success criteria. You can have as many or as few as you want. It's up to you, whatever you think they will be able to handle. And that also depends on the scope of the project. But it's very important that it comes from the students, because then they know they're involved in it and they're much more engaged in it when they negotiate the success criteria. And of course, individuals are extremely important in this. You're not just assessing the group as a whole, you also need to focus on the individuals within the group. So now you can give the opportunity for individuals to create their own success criteria just for themselves. With the presentation, I will be successful if I contribute information and images for the slides. So if I do that, I know that I'm doing a good thing for the group and it's going to contribute to the end project. I will be successful if I speak for part of the presentation. And then looking at a skill, looking at communication, I will be successful if I listen to each of my teammates when they have suggestions. And I will be successful if I have the confidence to tell my teammates my idea. So you've given them some examples here, and then students can have some quiet time to think about the other success criteria that they feel will be evidence of them doing well. And again, it's coming from the students. And again, this is a document that they can refer back to. It can help keep them on track. It might help keep them motivated. And the important thing is they keep this document and this document, and they have their getting started document. So they're starting to build up this body of work. And at the moment, what they're building up is all their aims, what they're going to succeed at, what they're going to achieve. So now we need them to stay on track. A big problem with projects is the students maybe dawdling at the beginning and taking far too much time with brainstorming, having these outrageous ideas, which are amazing, but then they don't give themselves enough time to put those ideas into a practical model or a practical solution. They just have, their time management is off. So the next thing you want your students to do is to learn how to stay on track and learn how to track their time. This is an example of a Gantt chart. It's quite a complicated, maybe not a student-friendly Gantt chart, but it gives you an idea of splitting tasks up, setting completion dates, and then mapping out how long each task will take across days, or it can be done across hours. Okay, so you can break it up any way you want, and you can make it as simple as you want. Okay, so this is quite a complicated one we might use for work, or we might use on large projects within an industry. But you can find these templates within PowerPoint and other software, and they're really user-friendly, they're color-coded, and what the students can do is track each task and put a name. This is Federica's task, this is Joe's task, this is Johnny's task. And they have their dates and their timelines, and they're tracking as they go along. But importantly, they also have their milestones on there, and they can color code when a milestone has been hit or completed. And this isn't just something that they show you at the end of their project. You're checking this with them as they go along, and they're talking you through it. It also helps them see when they've lagged behind a little bit, or they're not quite there. And they're tracking, whatever way they decide to track their project, is another thing that you can assess. So they submit this at the end, and it's a way that you can track or assess that skill of planning and time management, along with the outcome. So I can see they tracked it really well, and here's a really successful outcome. They did extremely well in that area. Last week, I heard some questions, or I saw some questions come in on the chat box about keeping your students on task. This is all very nice, but how do you keep your students on task and keep them focused throughout the project work? Now, this is another thing that can be assessed, okay? So Lukasz last week commented or spoke briefly about group roles. Group roles are a fantastic part of project work and can be something that you assess, and it can come under the heading of time management, but also it could be good to assess collaboration and communication. So first of all, you need to decide in each group what roles are needed, who's best suited to each role, and what are the expectations. If it's your students' first time involved in this type of really in-depth project work that's going to be assessed, I suggest that you lead the way with this. However, the next time round or after that, the students can then decide this. The students decide what roles are needed, which of us is best to do each role, and what, now I have this role, what are my expectations in this role? So it's exactly like what was mentioned last week. You don't need to launch into everything straight away and have it very complicated and very difficult from the beginning. You can ease students into this type of project work, so you can set everything up for them. And then when they get used to it in the next project work, they have more autonomy and they're setting up the roles. Daily accountability, we know as adults, is really important. If you want to achieve anything, really, you need to be accountable. You usually need to talk to somebody or check in with somebody or show your progress to somebody else. So it's important that the students are also, as they go through their project, they have time at the end of the day to write down or note what they've achieved. What have we achieved today? What do we need to do tomorrow? And what changes need to be made? So what do I need to do to get to the next step of this project? So it's just like what we do as adults. You know, we get to the end of our day and we look at our list and we reprioritize and we scratch some things off and we add some things. The students should be doing this too, and get them to do it in a systematic way. So they do it every day, for a certain length of time, and they save that, that goes into their body of work. And then finally, regular reporting to the teacher is going to keep them on track. So they're showing you their tracker. They're showing you who's doing what each day. They are reporting on what they're achieving each day. They might be telling you, well, we're a little bit behind on this, but we're ahead on this, so we're nearly there. And you're giving feedback regularly. So the regularity of this reporting and feedback depends on the length of the project. If the project is a week long, you'll need to do this once a day or even a couple of times throughout the lesson. If the project is a whole term, maybe two months or a little bit longer, you might want to do this once a week or twice a week. It's up to you, and it's up to how your students work and what your timetable looks like. If you are online doing this, you may want to do it in breakout rooms with the students, 3 students and the teacher together, so that you get to focus on them. Or you may want to set up tutorial times. But this regular reporting to you and your helpful feedback to them is all part of the assessment process, because what you get from their reporting, you can use as formative assessment, keeping track of what they're reporting and noting down comments and giving them comments for improvement or suggestions for improvement. And I know that there's always worry about how do we monitor what students are doing when we're all online. When we're in class, it's quite easy because we can look over their shoulder, we can see what they're doing, we're all there together. Online, you need to find a space where everything can be kept together. So that might be Padlet, which you can see on the top left. It might be G Suite, which is the Google application with Docs and Excel, and you can create folders and class folders. It might be Microsoft Teams, or it could be something as simple as Book Creator. But it needs to be something that you have access to and you can go in and check their progress. You can see it happening. And you would go in and check this when they're feeding back to you, whenever you've set for them to report back to you. And you're giving them feedback not only on the work they're doing, but how they're organizing their work. And that comes under digital literacy. So you may also be formatively assessing them and thinking about a summative mark on how they're organizing their work electronically. Is it easy to follow? Is it easily clearly organized? Is it easy to find? So these are all things that you can assess. But keep in mind, not everything at once. Get into this step by step and spread it across your academic year, and you'll find it much easier then. If you try and do everything at once, on top of teaching, it's going to be a lot to take on. So throughout this session, I've been talking about the final body of work. So yes, they're going to have an outcome. They're going to have a presentation or a model or some sort of really lovely project work that they want to show you. But you need to assess everything they've done along the way. And you can do this by regularly collecting, checking in with them, their body of work. Okay, so everything I say here we have already spoken about. The getting started document, the very beginning. So you've got their you can even see their collaboration there. So if you have a very impressive, well filled out getting started document, and all students have contributed to it, maybe they've signed off on the parts they've contributed to, you can see, okay, from the beginning, this group have really gelled together. They've really worked hard together. They might want to include their initial brainstorming notes and their evidence of the research conducted. So they might want to include their links, all their information, where they got their sources. And if they want to go a step further, they could even include which research was the most beneficial to them. Their timeline or evidence of their planning and their tracking should be part of their body of work. Their roles and responsibilities should also be commented on. So when they're presenting at the end, it's not a bad idea for the student, when it's their turn to present, to say, my name is Federica, And my role was time management and milestones. So I had to keep everybody on track. And they may want to talk about what they found difficult, what they found easy, what they learned. They also need to keep a document of the skills they developed. Okay, so we can look at that in a moment, and we can look at a document that they can use for that. They want to talk about their challenges and their successes. They should be telling you in their final presentation something new that they learned, something that they think they will use in real life. It might be a skill that they'll use in college, or a skill that they'll use in work when they leave school. It's really nice, I think, in a final body of work, a final portfolio, to have photos or screenshots of the work in progress. It's lovely for them to have to look back on, and it's also it kind of gives a sense of ownership and a sense that they are able to document what's happening as it goes along. You may want to give them some reflection or self-assessment documents. So we talked about that with the daily self-assessment and group assessment, but they also might want to do some at the very end of their project. And finally, the project outcome itself. Okay, so then this is the solution that we came up with. But they're not just presenting that solution, they're presenting all the parts of the process of building up to that solution. And that makes it a lot easier for you to assess how they got there. When they are presenting, you don't want to be the only person in the room or in the virtual classroom going, very good, yes, interesting. And everybody else is silent. You have no idea if they're engaging. You have no idea if they are really taking it in, or if they're interested at all. So it's really important as you get towards the final part of your project, just before the presentations, that students know that they are going to be active participants in the audience. When a group is presenting, students should be noting questions that they're going to ask the group that are presenting, and then they engage in that. At the end of the presentation, they ask them whatever they want to ask them. They note the answer down. They put in a comment if they have any sort of comments themselves, like this was really well done, or I think I'll do this next time. And this type of presentation where the students are the engaged ones, it's not the teacher trying to push it along, is very helpful for them for improving next time. So it helps with their formative assessment and their self-assessment moving forward. Getting tips, stealing ideas from people, there's nothing wrong with that. I spoke about the student reflection or self-assessment. So they're thinking about, how did it go? At the beginning, I thought about what success looked like for me and for my group. Now I'm reflecting on how it actually went. Did I live up to what I wanted to do? And again, it's a document that looks a little bit like their getting started document. They can grade themselves, they can give themselves stars, or they can give themselves comments. They can list the project work that they completed. Now they're doing this on an individual level, so they can list what they actually contributed to the project work, the new skills that they learned, something they're proud of, and something they will improve on next time. It depends on the school. Some schools do use reflection and self-assessment forms as part of a body of assessment, but that's up to you. You may just want to have it as the student's personal reflective diary, or you might want it included in what you're going to assess overall. And there's always this question of summative or formative assessment. It's very difficult to get the balance right. In my opinion, just from the classes and the lessons that we conduct in ATC, it's really nice to have a balance of both. More formative than summative. So giving formative feedback along the way in the form of comments, discussing things with students, working things out, pointing them in the right direction. That is always very, very helpful for students. but they always, we find, want a summative grade at the end. And that's where your rubric comes in, and you're checking success criteria, and maybe giving them a grade plus a meaty comment that can help them progress next time. With our particular students that come over, they are quite grades focused, so we tend to combine the two. So throughout the project, the students are reporting their progress, they're showing their Gantt chart, their tracker, they're reporting on their role and their achievements in the role. And as that's going along, you're giving verbal and written feedback to help the students, but remember also to keep a record of it yourself. So for each group and for each student, you have a record of that formative assessment that you're giving to the students as they go along. And then after the final presentation, we're kind of onto a form of summative assessment. So the students are getting questioned from the audience, and you might be able to assess or give feedback on how they handle those questions, but also how the individuals in the audience are handling asking questions and looking for more information. You can grade based on your rubrics, and you can reflect that to your school's grading system, but make sure that your rubrics are focused on the important things like the 21st century skills, presentation skills, and the project outcome. You can give feedback based on success criteria, and it's also important, even if your feedback is summative with a grade, combine it with verbal and written feedback so that students have something tangible, comments that they can use when they go into their next project in the next term or next month, whenever they go into it again. As Anna said at the beginning of this session, assessment is massive, it's huge. And to be honest, you could do an entire series just on assessment. But I think if you're striving for a balance between formative and summative, and you're keeping those skills in mind, and you're engaging the students in self-assessment and knowing that they have to report to you as they go along, you're doing a good job with assessing project work. Recording assessment can be a little bit mind-blowing. You may have to record your assessment the way your school tells you to. So you may have a very formal way of recording assessment. It may be comments for skills assessment, continuous assessment of some sort. So, you know, every day do you have to give a comment, or maybe every week you need to give a comment, and then summative grades at the end of the project. The project may be the assessment at the end of term. What I would say is really the thing to keep in mind, whatever way you're asked to record your assessment, whatever way assessment is expected in your school, make sure that what you're assessing and the way you're assessing is meaningful and useful for your future planning. That's really important. So make sure that it's helping you with your future planning. And even more important, make sure it's actually meaningful for the students in their progress. So if it's giving the students the opportunity to reflect and get better, you're doing a good job. If it becomes a box ticking exercise or numbers on a grid and the students don't know what that means, don't do it. So make sure it's meaningful, it's helping the students progress. And I feel from our young learners, that's the way forward with assessment. It actually helps them move to the next level. And finally, as I was completing this talk and looking through it, I thought to myself, it's all very meta, because we're the project managers of our students and we're trying to teach them to become project managers. So we're mapping out our structure and making sure that rubrics are in place and that success criteria are in place. Your students are also doing that. They're mapping out a project and they're making sure that they're hitting their success criteria and that they're getting towards their objective. And then at the end, everybody is learning from that experience, and everybody hopefully will improve and move on. I have some useful links here: Rubric Makers, Smartsheet, Padlet, Book Creator, and some really good websites and articles that keep it nice and simple for assessing project work. So these are really useful practical links that should help you going forward. And finally, I would just like to say thank you so much for coming along today. There was a huge amount in that presentation. I hope it wasn't too much, but I really appreciate all the interaction in the chat box. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Joanne. That was absolutely fabulous.
Thank you.
And you can see the love in the chat box. Look at that. That is just beautiful.
Oh, thank you so much.
Indeed, look at that, Rosa. So it's marvelous. It was very informative. There was indeed so much in there. And I like how you've tried to sort of make it manageable for us, because we could talk about this for 2 days, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's massive. It is huge.
There are loads of questions, actually, and I have to say thank you to everyone for putting those questions in the chat or in the Q&A, but I don't think, unfortunately, we've got time to talk about all those questions. I've selected a few. If you don't mind, Joanne, can I ask you a few questions that the teachers put up for us?
Of course, yeah.
So one of the first questions relates to those the rubric, but before I'm going to ask the question, could you quickly explain what the difference is between a rubric and the success criteria?
That's a really good question. So it can be a kind of controversial area, rubrics and success criteria. The simplest way to think about it is a rubric is a set of comments that help us put a grade on a piece of work. So when you think of maybe the FCE grids, the Cambridge First grids, where you're trying to mark your students, it's a way of actually putting a grade on something. A success criteria is the evidence the students will look for to know that they're successful. So personally, now people might argue with me on this, I feel that success criteria are much more student-centered. So you would need to have a combination of very clear rubrics for your own idea of how a student is doing, and then the student needs student-friendly success criteria. They know how they'll meet those expectations. I hope that makes sense.
I would say the same. It's often a lot more visible, or at least tangible, so they know what they need to work towards, right?
Exactly. So, yeah. They're very kind of obvious milestones that they need to do, or targets that they need to do to be successful in the task.
And like you said, in that student-friendly language as well, so they can actually understand what they need to do.
Exactly.
So, the reason I'm asking is because Jared had a really good question about that. Should the students be given the rubric before they do the project, so they really understand what they need to do? Is that important?
Personally, I think yes. I would always give the students the rubric, but I would probably need to adapt. So the rubric I showed you today was very teacher-centered, and it was all in teacher language. I would adapt that, grade the language, make it a little bit easier. And yes, I would give it to the students, because I saw an analogy once, you're probably all familiar with it, but this idea of asking students to draw a house, and they draw the house, and then you tell them you get a mark for the curtains, you get a mark for a cat in the window, and they go, oh, we didn't know. So yeah, I would say give them a simplified version of the rubric.
It's again making it visible, right? Like you said, they need to know, what does it look like? What does good project work look like? Yeah.
Exactly.
There was another beautiful question, loads of beautiful questions, but I've picked the one from Rose, who is saying, what do you do, for example, with shy students or low-level language speakers? How can we encourage them to participate during this PBL?
It's always difficult, you know, it's really about the rapport with the student and making sure that they're in the right group for them, understanding what it is exactly that they shy away from and what they're able to excel at, and then maybe giving them a role that you know they'll feel you don't want them to stay in their comfort zone all the time, but you do want to start them off in their comfort zone. And as they start to build confidence, try and get them to try new things, or, they might be, for example, if they're afraid of talking to the teacher in English or feeding back in English, maybe you give them a mini challenge of, next week, you're going to lead the check-in with the teacher. So you're going to be talking a little bit about what you have done this week, and you can build them up so that by the time they have to actually give their part of the presentation or their talk, they are used to it. So they're not kind of like a rabbit in the headlights. But I think it is very much kind of easing them in and finding what they're comfortable with first. And there's never an ideal answer to that, because it's very difficult.
And I love the idea as well that you say, give them a warning. Next week, we're going to do that. So they have got all this time to prepare. You can actually support them with sentence starters. So they're actually enabled, right, to do that.
Exactly. Yeah. It's not about catching them out or putting them on the spot.
We want them to be successful. We want them to feel that they actually succeed, right? That's so important.
Absolutely.
And that maybe goes back to a question from Youssef. He asked very early on, how can we actually motivate students? Because some students just lack that enthusiasm for project work because they might not see the link to the academic performance that they're aiming for. How could we get students really motivated to go for this experience?
Well, if it's a case where they don't see it linked to academic performance, if they think, well, this is just kind of time to relax, then you can take it very seriously with that student, and you can go down that project management route, and you can go through with the student, look at all this work you're going to have to produce for me, and look at this mark, look at the top mark that I want to give you at the end. And if you can say to them, this mark is going to go towards credits or that type of thing. But if they see, it all comes back to structure and the focus on the process. If they see that this is a very serious process with lots of things that they're going to have to submit and they will be assessed on, then you're going to convince them that actually academically it's an important thing to do. If they're just kind of a student who's generally unmotivated, a nice thing to do, and I think this was mentioned last week, is to let them think of the topic. So again, put it back on them, and they can either have some sort of say in the topic or the outcome, or the success criteria, where you're not the one telling them what to do. You're kind of coming from their interests. But again, it's never an exact science. We're going to have unmotivated students, and it's just about keeping it student-centered. That helps a lot with that.
And I think it's always going to be the case, as I said in my webinar as well, it's impossible to do an activity in our classroom where everybody is 100% motivated. It would be ideal, but
it'd be amazing.
I've got one more question for you. Dina was asking, is there a minimum age for students? Because you mentioned something about young learners, but is there a minimum age that you say, this is when you can start doing some projects, but at this stage, they're still too young?
I'm very aware that in this presentation, I had kind of teenagers in mind, and it was quite, and all the assessment and everything I expected from them is kind of aimed at teenagers. I think if you have, groups of elementary school students, 5, 6, 7, they're on their way to, now maybe at 5 and 6 years old, they'll find the teamwork difficult, but you can do it in a small scale, graded, in a very simple way. And I would say, exactly like Lucas said last week, start small with them. And I think if you have very young learners like that, you can introduce this type of project work. And the earlier you introduce it, the better they will become at it. And it will really help them develop those interpersonal skills.
And again, your topic choice, I think, is really important with that lower age group, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It needs to be something that they can relate to, that they know and understand, and keep it simple. Don't overcomplicate it. I maybe would leave out the timelines with the 5-year-olds.
Oh yeah, those charts. Lovely. Thank you so much for all your answers. And thank you again, Joanne, for a fabulous webinar with lots of practical ideas. And also, I think lots of points to ponder for us to think about how we can set this up in our context. So thank you so much for doing that.
It was an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Great. I am going to take everyone through the end of the webinar because I think a few of you are asking about certificates. So let me get those slides up again, and then we can let you go back to work, because I think a lot of us are back in the classroom at the moment. So let me say thank you again for being here, for all your questions, and so sorry if I haven't asked your question to Joanne, but there were just so many questions in the chat box for us today. Fabulous. So one more thing before we head off. I'm not sure if you're aware, but Macmillan is also having their research program. It's very much dedicated language research, trying to collect data from you in the field, in the classroom, to sort of develop materials, webinars and practices based on your needs. Now, if you haven't checked that out, please go to the website that you can see on the screen. And there's a survey asking you about your own development, what's happening in your classroom. And based on that, Macmillan develops what they think teachers need next, because this might be the last webinar in the Back to School series, but it's not the last webinar from Macmillan. So please go and check it out. A nice thing to know might be as well that there's some white papers, some, what would we say, documents with activities for you that you can download on that site as well. And also every person who completes a survey, Macmillan automatically donates money to a charitable cause. So please check it out if you haven't been on that website yet.